In the vast expanse of the galaxy, where 1,000 species wage war among the stars, there exists a universal truth that every civilized being learns from birth. When humans arrive on a battlefield, everything changes. They are not the strongest. The Carathian warbeasts can tear through steel with their bare claws. They are not the fastest. The Valani scout ships move like liquid lightning through space. They are not the smartest. The Cerebral Collective processes data at speeds that make quantum computers seem sluggish. They are not even the most numerous. The swarm nations can darken entire solar systems with their fleets. But there is something about humans that defies every military doctrine, every strategic calculation, every logical prediction ever devised by the galactic community. Something that makes hardened warriors from species that have conquered worlds tremble at the mere mention of their name. Something that has earned them a reputation so fearsome that most civilizations prefer to negotiate surrender rather than face them in open combat. I am Zarathil of the Nexarian Empire, commander of the 47th Deep Strike Legion, veteran of 18 major campaigns across 4 sectors. I have seen the rise and fall of civilizations, witnessed the deployment of weapons that can crack moons, and stood firm against enemies that would make lesser beings weep with terror, until I witnessed humans on the battlefield with my own eyes. What I saw there changed everything I thought I knew about warfare, about courage, and about what it truly means to be a warrior. The humans didn't just fight, they transformed the very nature of combat itself. They turned impossible odds into victories, despair into hope, and certain death into legend. This is that story. This is why the galaxy fears them. This is why, after everything I've witnessed, I finally understand their fearsome reputation, and why, despite being their enemy, I've come to respect them more than any force in the known universe. The first time Zarathil heard the name Kepler 442 spoken in the war councils of the Nexarian Empire, it was with the casual indifference reserved for routine military operations. Another human colony world, another strategic resource to be claimed, another stepping stone in the Empire's inexorable march toward galactic dominance. The intelligence reports painted a picture so familiar it might have been copied from a dozen previous campaigns. A mining world with a population of roughly 2 million humans, defended by what appeared to be a standard colonial militia and a handful of outdated orbital defense platforms. Zarathil reviewed the tactical assessments with the methodical precision that had made her one of the Empire's most successful commanders. The planet possessed significant deposits of rare earth metals essential for advanced starship construction, particularly the crystalline matrices needed for faster-than-light navigation systems. Control of Kepler 442 would give the Nexarian Empire a stranglehold on FTL technology in 3 adjacent sectors, effectively crippling human expansion efforts in the region for decades to come. The operation was designated as a Class C engagement, meaning moderate resistance was expected, but victory was considered virtually guaranteed. The 47th Deep Strike Legion would spearhead the assault, supported by elements of the 12th Orbital Bombardment Wing and the 3rd Siege Corps. In total, nearly 50,000 battle-hardened Nexarian warriors would descend upon Kepler 442, supported by orbital fire that could level mountains and atmospheric fighters that could turn cities to ash in minutes. Standing in the holographic display chamber aboard the flagship Sovereign's Wrath, Zarathil watched the tactical projections play out with detached professionalism. Her 4 eyes, arranged in a diamond pattern on her elongated skull, tracked the movement of friendly units as they swept across the planet's surface in the simulation. Her scales, naturally a deep blue-green, had taken on the silver-grey coloration that marked her as a seasoned combat veteran. Each scale bore microscopic etchings that told the story of her service. 18 major campaigns, 47 tactical victories, 12 successful siege operations. The simulation showed the expected pattern of human resistance. Initial orbital strikes would cripple their communication networks and neutralize the most dangerous defensive installations. Atmospheric superiority would be established within the first 6 hours, followed by mass landings at strategic points across the planet's 3 major continents. Human forces would likely attempt to establish defensive positions around their primary population centers, but without orbital support or effective communications, they would be systematically isolated and destroyed. Expected human casualties, 1.8 million. Expected Nexarian casualties, fewer than 3,000. Duration of operation, 14 standard days. Zarathil's tactical staff reviewed these projections without question. After all, they had seen similar numbers play out across dozens of human worlds over the past decade. Humans, despite their reputation for stubbornness, followed predictable patterns when faced with overwhelming force. They would fight fiercely for a time, inflict what casualties they could, and then either surrender or die in place when their position became hopeless. It was almost mathematical in its precision. The fleet translation into the Kepler 442 system occurred exactly as planned, 16 hours before the scheduled commencement of bombardment operations. 97 Nexarian vessels materialized in the outer system, their dark hulls drinking in the light of the yellow star that these humans had optimistically named New Sol. Long-range sensors immediately began cataloging defensive assets while communications officers intercepted and analyzed human transmissions. What they found confirmed every expectation. The human orbital defenses consisted of 6 platforms of clearly obsolete design, their energy signatures suggesting they mounted weapons at least 2 decades behind current Nexarian standards. The colonial militia appeared to possess no vessels larger than system patrol craft, and even those numbered fewer than 20. Ground-based installations showed the typical human preference for distributed defensive networks rather than concentrated strongpoints, a strategy that had proven consistently ineffective against Nexarian combined arms tactics. Zarath allowed herself a moment of satisfaction as she reviewed the intelligence summary. Another clean operation, another successful addition to her record of service. The humans of Kepler 442 would discover, as so many others had before them, that determination and courage were poor substitutes for superior firepower and numerical advantage. The bombardment commenced precisely on schedule. Plasma cannons that could melt starship armor focused their fury on the orbital platforms, reducing them to expanding clouds of superheated debris within minutes. Missile barrages targeted ground-based sensor arrays, communication hubs, and power generation facilities with surgical precision. The humans managed to launch their patrol craft in a desperate attempt to interfere with the bombardment, but they were swept aside by Nexarian fighters like leaves before a hurricane. Within 4 hours, human resistance in orbit had been completely eliminated. Their communication networks were in ruins, their defensive installations destroyed, and their few remaining military assets scattered and ineffective. Everything was proceeding exactly according to plan. It was at this point that Zarathul received the first indication that something was wrong. The report came from Commander Vextai, leader of the reconnaissance squadron tasked with gathering detailed intelligence on human ground forces. His transmission crackled with the interference common in recently bombarded systems, but his words were clear enough. Legion Commander, we're detecting unusual movement patterns in human population centers. They're not establishing defensive perimeters as expected. Instead, they appear to be dispersing. Zarathul frowned, her scales shifting toward a darker hue that indicated concentration. Human dispersal tactics were not unknown, but they typically occurred only after defensive positions had been compromised, not before the ground assault had even begun. Elaborate, Commander. Are they evacuating to prepared fallback positions? Negative, Legion Commander. Our deep scans show no evidence of prepared positions. The humans appear to be moving in small groups toward locations with no apparent strategic value. Some are heading for the industrial districts that we've already targeted for destruction. Others are moving toward areas with no significant resources or defensive advantages. It's almost as if they're... Vextai paused, and when he continued, there was uncertainty in his voice that Zarathul had never heard from him before. It's almost as if they're positioning themselves to fight everywhere at once. The tactical implications of this development rippled through Zarathul's mind like stones dropped in still water. Fighting everywhere at once was not a strategy. It was suicide. Dispersed forces could not concentrate firepower, could not provide mutual support, could not establish the kind of defensive positions necessary to slow an advancing enemy. It violated every principle of military science that had been proven valid across 1,000 battlefields on 100 worlds. Unless, of course, the humans knew something that the Nexarian Empire did not. Zarathul called up detailed orbital surveillance imagery on her command displays, studying the movement patterns that Vextai had reported. The human populations of 3 major cities were indeed dispersing, but as she watched the data streams update in real time, she began to notice something that the preliminary reports had missed. The dispersal was not random. There were patterns within the apparent chaos, subtle but unmistakable to a mind trained in tactical analysis. Small groups of humans were positioning themselves at key infrastructure nodes, power distribution centers, water treatment facilities, transportation hubs, and communication relays. Other groups were moving toward elevated positions that would provide excellent fields of fire over likely Nexarian advance routes. Still others were disappearing into the extensive tunnel systems that seemed to connect every major population center on the planet. It was not dispersal at all, Zarathul realized. It was deployment. The humans were not running from the coming battle. They were preparing to turn their entire world into a battlefield. She opened a communication channel to her subordinate commanders, her voice carrying the authority of 2 decades of military service. All unit commanders, update your tactical assessments. The humans are not following predicted defensive patterns. Recommend shifting to extended siege protocols and preparing for guerrilla resistance operations. The responses came back quickly, but they carried an undercurrent of confusion that troubled her. Her officers had been trained to fight conventional forces using conventional tactics. The prospect of facing an enemy that had turned an entire planet into a weapon system was outside their experience. As the Nixarian assault forces began their final approach to the planet's surface, long-range sensors detected something else that defied explanation. Energy signatures were appearing across the planet's surface at locations that orbital bombardment had supposedly neutralized. Not the massive signatures of military installations, but thousands of smaller sources scattered across hundreds of locations. Individual humans were powering up equipment that had somehow survived the bombardment. Weapon systems that should not exist were coming online in basements, caves, and hidden bunkers across 3 continents. Communication networks that should have been destroyed were establishing connections through pathways that seemed to bypass every critical node that the Nexarians had targeted. It was as if the humans had built a second military infrastructure beneath the one that showed up on sensors, a shadow army that existed in the spaces between what the Nexarian intelligence services believed to be reality. Zaratul felt the first cold touch of unease as she watched the tactical displays update with each new energy signature. Her experience fighting humans had taught her that they were dangerous when cornered, but this was something different. This was not desperation or courage in the face of impossible odds. This was preparation on a scale that suggested the humans had always known this day would come. They had been ready for the Nexarian Empire long before the first scout ship had entered their system. The landing operations began exactly on schedule, but within the first hour, Zarathul knew that every assumption in the tactical plan had been wrong. Her assault forces encountered not the scattered remnants of a devastated militia, but coordinated resistance from an enemy that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. Nixarian dropships found themselves taking fire from directions that should have been clear, encountering defensive positions that had not existed on any sensor scan, facing weapons that exceeded the suspected capabilities of human technology. The humans were not just fighting, they were fighting smart, fighting dirty, and fighting with a level of coordination that should have been impossible given the destruction of their command and control systems. As reports flooded in from across the battle zone, a pattern began to emerge that chilled Zarathul to her core. The humans were not trying to prevent the Nexarian invasion. They were drawing it in, channeling it, manipulating it into configurations that served their purposes rather than the invaders. Every tactical advantage that the Nexarians possessed was being turned against them through methods that defied conventional military logic. Standing in her command center, as the first day of what should have been a brief campaign drew to a close, Zarathul stared at tactical displays that showed something unprecedented in her experience. An Nexarian force that was winning every individual engagement while somehow losing the larger battle. The humans of Kepler 442 were teaching the Nexarian Empire a lesson that no military academy in the galaxy had ever thought to include in its curriculum. They were demonstrating that sometimes the most fearsome weapon in war was not superior technology or overwhelming numbers. Sometimes it was simply refusing to lose the way your enemy expected you to. The third day of the Kepler 442 campaign brought Zarathul face to face with a truth that would haunt her for the rest of her military career. Humans did not fight the same war as everyone else in the galaxy. She discovered this during what should have been a routine briefing in her command bunker, established in the ruins of what had once been the planet's primary spaceport. The facility had been secured after a brief but vicious firefight that had cost her forces nearly 200 casualties to dislodge. Fewer than 50 human defenders. By any conventional measure, it had been a clear Nexarian victory. The humans had been eliminated, the strategic position seized, and her command post established exactly as planned. It was only later that she began to understand the humans had wanted her to take the spaceport. Commander Vextai materialized in the holographic display, his image flickering with the interference that had plagued Nexarian communications since the landing began. His typically composed demeanor showed cracks of frustration that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. Legion Commander, I need to report casualties from yesterday's advance on Sector 7. Zarathul nodded, her attention split between the tactical updates scrolling across her displays and the growing list of anomalies that her intelligence staff was struggling to explain. Proceed, Commander.
We successfully cleared 12 square kilometers of territory, destroyed 6 human strongpoints, and eliminated approximately 300 enemy combatants.
However, our own casualties were higher than expected. The pause in Vextai's report drew Zarathal's full attention. Her reconnaissance commander was not given to understatement, and the hesitation in his voice suggested something significant. Define higher than expected, Commander.
473 casualties, Legion Commander.
Nearly 2-1 against us, despite overwhelming advantages in firepower, armor, and air support. The numbers hit Zarathal like a physical blow. In 18 major campaigns across 4 sectors, she had never sustained casualty ratios approaching parity with human forces, let alone negative ratios. The tactical doctrine that had served the Nexarian Empire for centuries was built on the assumption that superior technology and numbers would always translate to favorable casualty exchanges. How? The question emerged as barely more than a whisper. Vextai's image shifted as he accessed his tactical recordings. The humans are not fighting as individuals or even as traditional units, Legion Commander. They appear to be fighting as a single organism with distributed intelligence. When we concentrate force to destroy one position, they do not reinforce it. Instead, they coordinate attacks on our flanks and rear areas while the threatened position conducts a fighting withdrawal to prepared fallback positions that do not appear on our sensor scans until moments before they are occupied. The tactical display activated, showing a 3-dimensional representation of yesterday's advance. Zarathal watched as blue icons representing Mixarian forces moved steadily forward, methodically clearing resistance from prepared human positions marked in red. It looked like a textbook combined arms operation, the kind that had broken the back of human resistance on dozens of other worlds. But as the recording continued, she began to see the subtleties that transformed apparent victory into something far more sinister. Each human position that was overrun had been evacuated just moments before destruction, with its defenders melting away through routes that sensors insisted did not exist. Meanwhile, new red icons appeared behind the advancing Nexarian forces, striking at supply lines, communication nodes, and isolated units with precision that suggested real-time intelligence of impossible accuracy. They are not trying to hold ground, Zarathal observed, her tactical training finally providing a framework for what she was witnessing. They are using space to buy time and inflict casualties.
That is our assessment as well, Legion Commander.
But the implications are troubling. If the humans can sustain this pattern of operations, they can bleed us indefinitely, while preserving their own combat strength through tactical withdrawal. Standard Nexarian doctrine assumes that human forces will eventually be forced to defend fixed positions that can be destroyed through concentrated firepower. Zarathal studied the tactical display with growing unease. The pattern was clear once you knew what to look for, but it violated so many assumptions about human behavior that her officers had been blind to it for days. Humans were supposed to be emotional, territorial creatures who would fight to the death for their homes and families. The defenders of Kepler 442 were certainly fighting, but they seemed to regard the entire planet as home territory, willing to trade any specific location for the opportunity to inflict casualties on the invaders. It was, she realized, the difference between fighting for ground and fighting for victory. A new communication channel opened, carrying the voice of Captain Morden from the 3rd Siege Corps. Legion Commander, we've encountered a problem during our assault on the Northern Industrial Complex. Report, Captain. The facility appears to have been prepared for demolition, but not in the way we expected. The humans have not simply rigged the structures for destruction. They have converted the entire complex into what can only be described as a weapon system. When our assault forces entered the facility, they triggered a sequence of explosions, fires, and toxic releases that turned the environment itself against us. Zarathal felt her scales shift toward the deep purple that indicated extreme concentration. Clarify, Captain. Are you saying the humans have weaponized their own industrial infrastructure? Affirmative, Legion Commander. Chemical storage tanks were repositioned to create toxic clouds along our approach routes. Manufacturing equipment was modified to produce shrapnel and debris fields. The facility's power systems were overloaded to create electromagnetic pulses that disabled our equipment. We have taken the complex, but at a cost of nearly 300 casualties, and the facility itself is now useless for its intended industrial purposes. The implication struck Zarathal like lightning. The humans were not simply defending their world, they were denying it to the invaders. Every strategic asset that the Nexarian Empire sought to capture was being systematically destroyed or corrupted to the point of uselessness. It was a scorched earth strategy, taken to its logical extreme. If the humans could not keep their world, they would ensure that the invaders gained nothing by taking it. More reports flooded in over the next few hours, each one painting a picture of human resistance that defied every expectation. Agricultural centers had been contaminated with biological agents that would render the soil unusable for decades. Mining facilities had been collapsed in ways that would require years to clear. Transportation networks had been damaged with surgical precision, creating bottlenecks that channeled Nexarian forces into prepared killing zones. The humans were not just fighting a military campaign, they were conducting a comprehensive denial operation that would leave Kepler 442 worthless to its conquerors even if every human on the planet was eventually killed. But perhaps most disturbing of all were the individual human combatants themselves. Zara Thul reviewed combat recordings throughout the day, studying the behavior of human fighters with the analytical precision that had made her reputation. What she saw challenged everything she thought she knew about warfare psychology. Nexarian combat doctrine was built on the principle that all rational beings would preserve their own lives when faced with impossible odds. Soldiers would fight bravely when victory was possible, retreat when defeat was certain, and surrender when survival was at stake. Human soldiers on Kepler 442 did none of these things. They fought with a calm, methodical determination that seemed unaffected by casualties, tactical setbacks, or the complete impossibility of achieving military victory through conventional means. They did not appear driven by the emotional fury that had characterized human resistance on other worlds, nor did they show signs of the desperation that typically preceded final collapse. Instead, they fought with the patience of craftsmen working on a project that they knew would take time to complete. In one particularly disturbing recording, a single human soldier, armed with nothing more than improvised explosives, held up an entire Nexarian company for nearly 6 hours. The human had positioned himself in a collapsed building that controlled access to a critical supply route, and had spent what must have been days preparing the position with traps, obstacles, and weapons caches that allowed him to engage the Nexarians from multiple angles. When the building was finally destroyed by orbital fire, killing the defender, Nexarian engineers discovered that he had used the delay to signal the positions and movements of the entire company to other human forces in the area. The 6-hour battle had not been a desperate last stand. It had been a reconnaissance operation conducted by a man who knew he would not survive to see its results. Zarathal watched the recording 3 times, trying to understand the mindset of a warrior who would sacrifice his life not for a chance at victory, but simply to provide intelligence that might be useful to others. It was a level of tactical thinking that seemed to treat individual survival as just one more resource to be expended in the service of larger strategic goals. By the end of the 4th day, the pattern was undeniable. Human casualties were mounting steadily, but so were Nexarian losses. More critically, the operational timeline had been completely shattered. What should have been a 2-week campaign was now projected to last months, and even that estimate assumed that Nexarian forces could adapt to fighting methods that seemed to evolve with each engagement. The humans were learning from every encounter, adjusting their tactics faster than Nexarian commanders could counter them. Weapons and techniques that worked in the morning would be neutralized by afternoon. Positions that seemed secure would suddenly become death traps when human forces appeared from directions that should have been impossible. Standing in her command bunker as another day of operations concluded, Zara Thul reviewed casualty reports that told a story she had never encountered in nearly 2 decades of military service. The Nexarian Empire was winning every tactical engagement while somehow losing operational control of the planet. Her forces held every major population center, controlled all significant infrastructure, and had eliminated organized human military resistance. Yet she was beginning to suspect that none of that mattered. The real war, she was learning, was not being fought for control of territory or resources. It was being fought for the right to define what victory actually meant. And in that contest, the humans of Kepler 442 were not just holding their own. They were teaching the Nexarian Empire that sometimes the most effective way to win a war was to change the rules until your enemy's advantages became disadvantages, until their strengths became weaknesses, and until their definition of victory became meaningless. As she prepared for another night of operations, Zara Thul found herself facing a question that no Nexarian commander had ever been forced to consider. What do you do when the enemy refuses to lose the war you came to fight and instead insists on fighting the war they choose? The first time Zarathol saw a human smile in the midst of combat, she understood that her enemy was not just different from everything she had been trained to fight. They were something entirely outside the experience of galactic civilization. It happened during the assault on Settlement Gamma 7, a small mining town that intelligence reports had identified as a probable command center for human resistance operations. The settlement sat in a valley between 2 low mountain ranges, its position offering excellent natural defensive advantages that the humans had enhanced with prepared positions and interlocking fields of fire. Standard Nexarian doctrine called for orbital bombardment followed by ground assault. a combination that had proven effective against human defensive positions on dozens of other worlds. But as Zarathul was learning, nothing about Kepler 442 followed standard patterns. The bombardment proceeded exactly as planned, reducing the visible structures of Settlement Gamma 7 to rubble and presumably eliminating the human defenders. Reconnaissance flights detected no significant human presence in the area, and thermal imaging showed only the expected heat signatures from fires and electrical systems damaged in the attack. When the assault force moved in to secure the area, they expected to find the smoking ruins of another human stronghold. Instead, they found themselves walking into the most sophisticated trap that any Nexarian commander had encountered in living memory. The humans had not been destroyed by the orbital bombardment. They had been waiting for it. Every visible structure in Settlement Gamma 7 had been a decoy, carefully designed to present the sensor signatures and thermal profiles that would attract enemy fire while concealing the real defensive network that lay buried beneath meters of rock and specially treated soil. The bombardment had destroyed nothing of military value while providing the human defenders with precise intelligence about Nexarian targeting priorities, weapons capabilities, and tactical preferences. When the assault force entered the valley, they found themselves surrounded by an enemy that attacked from below rather than from prepared positions on the high ground. Tunnels that appeared on no sensor scan opened to release human fighters who struck with devastating precision before disappearing back into the earth. Weapons positions emerged from concealment to fire a few rounds, then vanished again before return fire could be brought to bear. It was during one of these engagements that Zarathul, observing from an armored command vehicle, saw something that would change her understanding of human warfare forever. A squad of Nexarian assault troops had cornered a human fighter in what appeared to be a dead-end canyon. The human was clearly wounded, his primitive armor damaged and his weapon nearly depleted. By any rational calculation, he was moments away from death or capture, facing odds that no sane being would consider survivable. But as the Nexarian troops closed in for the kill, the human looked directly at Zarathul's command vehicle and smiled. It was not the desperate grin of someone facing death with false bravado, nor the grimace of pain from his obvious injuries. It was the quiet, satisfied smile of someone who had just accomplished exactly what he had set out to do. The explosion that followed collapsed half the canyon, burying the human fighter along with 8 Nexarian assault troops and revealing a carefully prepared demolition charge that had been waiting for exactly this moment. In the seconds before the blast, Zarathul understood that the entire engagement had been orchestrated by the human defender. From the apparent retreat into the canyon to the positioning of her own observation post where she would have the perfect view of what followed. The human had not been trapped and cornered. He had been leading his enemies into a position where his own death would serve a strategic purpose. And he had smiled because he knew that his sacrifice would accomplish something that surviving could not. Over the following days, Zarathul began to recognize that smile in the faces of human defenders across the planet. It appeared on the features of fighters who detonated explosive charges while enemy troops were crossing bridges they defended. It lit the eyes of snipers who took impossible shots knowing that revealing their positions would mean certain death. It marked the expressions of pilots who flew damaged aircraft into Nexarian positions rather than attempting to reach safety. The humans of Kepler 442 were not just willing to die for their cause. They were eager to die in ways that would maximize the damage to their enemies. But the underground war that Settlement Gamma 7 revealed was about more than individual sacrifice. As Nexarian forces pushed deeper into the planetary defensive network, they discovered that the humans had spent decades converting their entire world into a weapon system of staggering complexity and sophistication. The tunnel networks that connected every major settlement were not simply transportation routes or hiding places. They were a three-dimensional battlefield that allowed human forces to appear anywhere on the planet's surface within hours, engage Nexarian forces from unexpected directions, and disappear again before effective countermeasures could be deployed. More than that, the tunnels themselves had been weaponized. Sections could be flooded with toxic gases at a moment's notice. Others were rigged with explosives that could collapse kilometers of passageway, trapping or killing anyone unfortunate enough to be inside. Still others were equipped with environmental systems that could create extreme heat, cold, or pressure changes that would incapacitate invaders while leaving human defenders unaffected. The humans had turned their own planet's geology into an ally. But it was the discovery of the human communication system that truly impressed and horrified Zarathul in equal measure. Nexarian intelligence had assumed that the destruction of surface communication networks would blind the human defenders, forcing them to operate as isolated units without coordination or strategic direction. Instead, they found that human forces were more coordinated after the bombardment than they had been before it. The The humans had built a communication network that used the planet itself as a transmission medium. Seismic sensors positioned throughout the tunnel system could detect coded vibrations transmitted through bedrock, allowing near-instantaneous communication across planetary distances without using any technology that could be detected or jammed by conventional means. Human forces could coordinate operations, share intelligence, and adapt tactics in real time while remaining completely invisible to Nexarian electronic warfare capabilities. They had created a planetary nervous system that made every human defender part of a single, distributed intelligence. The psychological impact of fighting such an enemy began to show in her troops after the first week. Nexarian soldiers trained to fight against opponents who followed predictable patterns and responded to superior force with withdrawal or surrender, found themselves facing an enemy that seemed to anticipate their moves before they made them. Equipment that should have provided decisive advantages malfunctioned in ways that suggested sabotage by agents who had somehow penetrated Nexarian security. Positions that should have been secure became death traps when human forces attacked from directions that should have been impossible. Her soldiers began to report that they felt like they were fighting the planet itself rather than its human inhabitants. Zarathal reviewed psychological evaluation reports with growing concern. Combat stress casualties were mounting at unprecedented rates, not from the intensity of individual engagements, but from the constant awareness that the enemy could strike from anywhere at any time. Her troops were developing a paranoid vigilance that was exhausting them even when they were not in active combat. The humans were waging psychological warfare on a planetary scale, using their own world as a weapon to demoralize and disorient their enemies. But perhaps most disturbing was what Zarathul learned about the human approach to casualties and resource management. Nexarian military doctrine, like that of most galactic civilizations, was based on the assumption that all rational beings would seek to preserve their forces and minimize their losses. Tactics were designed to achieve objectives while expending the minimum amount of personnel and equipment necessary for success. The humans of Kepler 442 operated under no such constraints. They expended lives, equipment, and resources with a calculation that treated their own forces as consumable assets in service of strategic goals. But unlike the desperate waste of resources that characterized most failing military campaigns, human expenditure was precise, measured, and devastatingly effective. Every human death accomplished something. Every destroyed position served a purpose. Every seemingly wasteful expenditure of resources was revealed to be part of a larger plan that maximized damage to Nexarian forces while advancing objectives that were not immediately apparent. The humans were not just willing to trade unfavorably in terms of casualties and resources, they were better at making those trades than species that had been waging interstellar war for millennia. By the 10th day of operations, Zarathal found herself facing a reality that no Nexarian commander had ever been forced to confront. Her forces controlled the surface of Kepler 442, occupied every major population center, and had eliminated organized human military resistance according to every conventional metric of success. Yet the planet was more hostile to Nexarian forces than it had been on the first day of the invasion. Human attacks were increasing in frequency, sophistication, and effectiveness. Casualties mounted daily, not from desperate last stands or futile gestures of defiance, but from carefully planned operations that achieved specific tactical objectives while inflicting maximum damage on the invaders. Supply lines were under constant threat from an enemy that could appear anywhere and disappear before retaliation was possible. Most troubling of all, the humans showed no sign of the gradual degradation in morale and effectiveness that should have resulted from 2 weeks of continuous combat against overwhelming odds. If anything, their operations were becoming more coordinated and more effective as they learned to exploit every weakness in Nexarian tactics and equipment. Standing in her command bunker as another night fell over a world that refused to surrender, Zarathul stared at tactical displays that told a story she had never encountered in 18 major campaigns. The Nexarian Empire was winning a war against an enemy that was somehow becoming stronger through defeat, more dangerous through losses, and more effective through destruction. The humans of Kepler 442 were not just refusing to lose. They were demonstrating that in some contexts, losing could be a form of victory, that destruction could be a weapon, and that defeat could be transformed into strength through methods that no military academy in the galaxy had ever thought to teach. For the first time in her career, Zarathul began to understand why the mere mention of humans in combat could silence a room full of veteran warriors from species that had conquered solar systems. It was not because humans were unbeatable in conventional terms, it was because they refused to fight conventional wars. The human attack on forward operating base Nexus Prime came from the dead. Zarathul learned this when she reviewed the sensor logs from that terrible night, trying to understand how an enemy that had been systematically eliminated could launch the most devastating assault of the entire campaign against what should have been the most secure Nexarian position on the planet. Forward operating base Nexus Prime had been established according to standard Nexarian military doctrine in the ruins of Kepler 442's former capital city. The location provided excellent sightlines for defensive weapons, abundant shelter for equipment and personnel, and access to the infrastructure necessary to support large-scale military operations. More importantly, the area had been thoroughly cleared of human presence through a series of methodical sweep operations that had accounted for every civilian and military defender in the sector, or so Zarathul had believed. The base had been operational for 6 days when the attack began, and by all conventional measures, it should have been impossible. Nexarian sensors maintained constant surveillance of every approach route. Automated defense systems covered every possible avenue of advance, and patrol forces conducted regular sweeps of the surrounding area to ensure that no human forces could establish positions within striking distance. The attack began at 0247 local time, not with the expected pattern of harassing fire from concealed positions, but with coordinated strikes on critical systems throughout the base. Communication arrays went down simultaneously across multiple sectors. Power distribution nodes exploded in carefully timed sequence. Ammunition storage facilities detonated with precision that suggested detailed knowledge of their contents and vulnerabilities. Within minutes, forward operating base Nexus Prime was crippled, its defensive capabilities compromised, and its command structure disrupted. But what happened next defied every assumption about human military capabilities that the Nexarian Empire had developed over decades of conflict. The human assault force that emerged from the ruins of the capital city moved with coordination that should have been impossible without the communication networks that orbital bombardment had destroyed weeks earlier. They struck at precisely the right moments and locations to exploit every weakness that the initial sabotage had created. More disturbing still, they demonstrated intimate knowledge of Nexarian tactical procedures, equipment limitations, and command structures. They fought as if they had been observing and studying Nexarian operations for the entire duration of the campaign. Zarathul watched the battle unfold from her orbital command post, her 4 eyes tracking the movement of forces across tactical displays that painted a picture of military disaster. Her ground commanders reported that human fighters were appearing from locations that had been thoroughly searched and cleared, using weapons that exceeded the known capabilities of colonial militia, and demonstrating tactical skills that suggested professional military training. But the sensor logs revealed something far more disturbing than superior human equipment or training. They showed that many of the human fighters moving through the ruined city were individuals who had been confirmed killed in previous engagements. The realization struck Zarathul like a physical blow, as she cross-referenced biometric data from the assault with casualty records from earlier operations. Facial recognition systems, genetic scanners, and combat behavior analysis all confirmed the impossible. Humans who had died fighting Nexarian forces weeks earlier were somehow participating in the attack on Nexus Prime. Her first assumption was that the identification systems had been compromised, that human technology was somehow spoofing Nexarian sensors to create false readings. But as she dug deeper into the data, examining recordings from multiple sources and verification systems, the evidence became undeniable. The humans of Kepler 442 had found a way to return their dead to the battlefield. The truth, when Zarathul finally pieced it together from intelligence reports and captured human equipment, was both simpler and more terrifying than she had imagined. The humans had not actually resurrected their fallen warriors. Instead, they had created the most comprehensive battlefield intelligence network that any species in the galaxy had ever developed. Every human who died fighting the Nexarian invasion carried recording equipment that captured not just their final moments, but detailed observations of enemy tactics, equipment, and procedures. This information was transmitted through the planet's seismic communication network to central analysis facilities hidden deep within the tunnel systems. There, human military specialists studied every engagement, catalogued every Nexarian weakness, and developed countermeasures that were distributed to surviving fighters within hours. But the system went beyond simple intelligence gathering. The humans had used their recordings of fallen warriors to create detailed behavioral profiles that could be uploaded to combat androids, artificial intelligence systems, and even volunteer fighters who underwent psychological conditioning to mimic the combat styles of the dead. The result was an army that literally learned from every death, that preserved the tactical knowledge of every fallen warrior, and that could deploy the combat experience of soldiers who had died weeks earlier in battles happening today. Zarathul studied detailed analysis reports that described human fighters who moved with the exact combat patterns of dead defenders, who used identical tactical approaches to warriors who had been eliminated in previous engagements, and who seemed to possess memories of battles they could not possibly have survived. The humans had created a form of immortality that was purely military in nature. Their warriors could die, but their knowledge, their skills, and their tactical understanding lived on in the fighters who came after them. The psychological impact on Nexarian forces was immediate and devastating. Soldiers who had fought hard-won battles against human defenders found themselves facing the same enemies again days later, employing the same tactics, but improved by the knowledge of how they had been defeated the first time. Positions that had been secured through significant casualties were lost to attacks that seemed to anticipate every defensive measure the Nexarians had prepared. Combat stress casualties mounted as Nexarian troops began to report that they were fighting an enemy that could not be permanently killed, that learned from every defeat, and that seemed to grow stronger every time it was destroyed. But the attack on forward operating base Nexus Prime revealed something even more disturbing about human warfare philosophy. As Zarathul analyzed the tactical recordings from that night, she realized that the assault had not been designed to destroy the base or eliminate its garrison. Instead, it had been carefully planned to gather intelligence about Nexarian response procedures, command structures, and tactical adaptations that had been developed over the previous weeks of fighting. The humans had sacrificed hundreds of fighters not to achieve a military victory, but to learn how the Nexarian Empire would respond to a large-scale coordinated assault on a major installation. They had treated their own attack as a form of reconnaissance in force, accepting massive casualties in return for intelligence that would make future operations more effective. The attack had been a learning exercise conducted at the cost of human lives. This revelation forced Zarathul to reconsider everything she thought she understood about the conflict on Kepler 442. What she had interpreted as increasingly desperate human resistance was actually a systematic program of experimentation designed to understand Nexarian military capabilities and develop countermeasures. Every human attack, every defensive operation, every apparent tactical failure had been part of a comprehensive intelligence-gathering effort that treated the entire war as a laboratory for studying enemy capabilities. The humans were not just fighting the Nexarian invasion. They were conducting research on how to defeat the Nexarian Empire. The implications rippled through her mind like stones dropped in still water. If the humans could preserve and transmit the tactical knowledge gained from every engagement, then every battle they fought made them more dangerous, not weaker. If they could study Nexarian responses to develop countermeasures, then every tactical advantage the Empire enjoyed was temporary at best. Most terrifying of all, if they could create artificial warriors that possessed the skills and knowledge of dead fighters, then human losses were not actually losses in any meaningful military sense. They were investments in a learning process that would eventually produce an enemy capable of defeating any force the galaxy could bring against them. Standing in her command center as reports continued to arrive from the disaster at Nexus Prime, Zarathul found herself confronting a question that challenged every assumption about warfare that had guided her career. How do you defeat an enemy that treats death as education, defeat as intelligence gathering, and destruction as research data? The humans of Kepler 442 were demonstrating that in some contexts, losing a battle could be more valuable than winning it, that casualties could be transformed into assets, and that military defeat could become the foundation for ultimate victory. For the first time since taking command of the 47th Deep Strike Legion, Zarathul began to understand why human colonies were considered the most dangerous military targets in known space. It was not because humans were better warriors than other species, or because they possessed superior technology or tactics. It was because they had developed a form of warfare that grew stronger through defeat, learned from destruction, and transformed every loss into an advantage that could be used against future enemies. As she prepared to report the situation to her superiors, Zarathul realized that she was no longer fighting a campaign to conquer a human colony. She was participating in a research project conducted by the human species to learn how to wage war against the Nexarian Empire. And with each passing day, their research was becoming more successful. The evacuation order came on the 28th day of what had been planned as a 14-day campaign, delivered in the form of an encrypted transmission that contained only 43 words. Legion Commander Zarathul. Cease operations Kepler. 442 immediately. Withdraw all forces to orbital stations. Prepare for fleet extraction. Mission parameters have changed. New intelligence requires strategic reassessment. Acknowledge receipt and compliance. Zarathul read the message 3 times, her scales shifting through the color spectrum that indicated profound confusion mixed with relief. After 4 weeks of warfare that had challenged every assumption she held about military science, the prospect of leaving Kepler 442 should have brought nothing but satisfaction. Instead, she found herself staring at tactical displays that told a story of incomplete understanding, of lessons learned too late to matter. The human colony that was supposed to have fallen in 2 weeks had not just survived the assault of the Nexarian Empire's most experienced assault legion. It had transformed that assault into something that resembled a teaching exercise more than a military campaign. Her casualty reports painted a picture that would haunt her for the rest of her career. Nearly 15,000 Nexarian warriors dead or wounded, representing 30% of the invasion force. Equipment losses that included 47 atmosphere fighters, 12 orbital bombardment platforms, and enough ground vehicles to supply a full mechanized division. Supply expenditures that had drained resources allocated for 3 separate campaigns. Against this, human casualties were estimated at approximately 40,000 military personnel and nearly 200,000 civilians. By any conventional measure, the Nexarian Empire had inflicted catastrophic losses on the defenders of Kepler 442. Yet Zarathul knew that the humans had won. They had won not by defeating the Nexarian invasion, but by surviving it long enough to study it, analyze it, and develop countermeasures that would make future human colonies exponentially more dangerous to attack. Every tactical innovation that her forces had employed, every technological advantage they had exploited, every strategic approach they had attempted had been dissected, understood, and neutralized. The humans of Kepler 442 had paid a price in blood that would have broken any other species in the galaxy. In return, they had purchased something of incalculable value, a comprehensive understanding of how the Nexarian Empire waged war. The withdrawal operation began immediately, but even the process of leaving the planet demonstrated how thoroughly the tactical situation had been reversed. Nexarian forces that had landed on Kepler 442, with overwhelming advantages in mobility, firepower, and reconnaissance, found themselves retreating under constant harassment from an enemy that knew their procedures better than they knew them themselves. Human forces struck at precisely the moments when withdrawing units were most vulnerable, exploiting gaps in defensive coverage that should have been impossible to predict without access to classified Nexarian tactical doctrine. They targeted equipment and personnel with surgical precision, focusing their attacks on assets that would be most difficult to replace, rather than simply inflicting maximum casualties. They were not trying to prevent the Nexarian withdrawal. They were using it as one final opportunity to gather intelligence and test countermeasures. Zarathul watched the evacuation proceed from her orbital command post, studying the tactical displays that showed a retreat operation proceeding exactly according to plan, while somehow serving the strategic purposes of the enemy more than her own forces. Every stage of the withdrawal provided the humans with detailed intelligence about Nexarian logistics capabilities, equipment vulnerabilities, and command procedures under stress. The humans were learning as much from their enemy's retreat as they had from the invasion itself. But it was during the final stage of the evacuation that Zarathul encountered something that would change her understanding of human warfare forever. As the last Nexarian ground forces prepared to lift off from the planet's surface, long-range sensors detected an unusual transmission originating from the human tunnel networks. The message was broadcast on standard diplomatic frequencies, encoded with Nexarian military protocols, and addressed specifically to her. Against every regulation and security procedure that governed her command, Zarathul authorized her communications staff to receive and decode the transmission. The voice that emerged from her command speakers was unmistakably human, speaking fluent Nexarian with an accent that suggested formal military training, but the words carried a weight of authority and understanding that commanded attention. Legion Commander Zarathul of the Nexarian 47th Deep Strike Legion. I am Colonel Sarah Chen, Commander of the Kepler 442 Colonial Defense Force. I am transmitting this message to acknowledge your tactical competence and to express our respect for your conduct during this engagement. Zarathul felt her scales shift to colors she had not displayed since her academy training, patterns that indicated confusion so profound it approached philosophical crisis. No enemy commander in her experience had ever attempted direct communication during combat operations, let alone to offer what appeared to be professional courtesy. The human voice continued. Your forces have conducted this campaign with skill and honor. You have demonstrated tactical flexibility, concern for civilian casualties, and adherence to galactic conventions regarding military conduct. These qualities are respected among our people, even when displayed by those who come to destroy our worlds. The transmission paused, and when it resumed, The tone carried a weight that suggested the speaker understood the full implications of what she was about to say. However, I must inform you that this engagement has served its primary purpose. We have gathered sufficient intelligence about Nexarian military capabilities, tactical doctrine, and strategic preferences to ensure that future human colonies will be far more difficult to conquer. The knowledge your forces have provided through your conduct of this campaign will be transmitted to every human military organization in this sector. Zarathul understood the implication immediately. The humans had not simply survived the Nexarian assault. They had documented it, analyzed it, and prepared countermeasures that would be available to every human colony that faced similar attacks in the future. Kepler 442 had been transformed into a training ground that would teach the entire human species how to fight the Nexarian Empire. The message concluded with words that would echo in Zarathul's mind for years to come. We hope that your superiors will understand what has transpired here. This world has served its purpose not as a prize to be won or lost, but as a classroom where both our species have learned valuable lessons. The question that remains is whether those lessons will lead to wisdom or to more sophisticated forms of warfare. As the last Nexarian transport lifted off from Kepler 442's surface, Zarathul found herself staring at a planet that looked nothing like the strategic asset that intelligence reports had described weeks earlier. The cities were ruins, the industrial facilities destroyed, the mining operations collapsed. By every conventional measure, Kepler 442 had been reduced to a worthless shell that would require decades to rebuild. But she knew that appearances could be deceiving where humans were concerned. In the days that followed, as her fleet made the transition back to Nexarian space, intelligence reports began to arrive that painted a picture of the campaign's true consequences. Human colonies throughout the sector were implementing defensive measures that perfectly countered standard Nexarian assault tactics. New weapon systems were appearing that seemed designed specifically to exploit the technological vulnerabilities that her forces had inadvertently revealed. Training programs were being established that taught human defenders to fight with the same tactical flexibility and adaptive thinking that had made Kepler 442 so difficult to conquer. The humans had not simply defended one world, they had used the sacrifice of that world to strengthen every human colony in the galaxy. Standing in her quarters aboard the flagship Sovereign's Wrath as it crossed the boundary into Imperial space, Zarathul composed the most difficult report of her military career. How do you explain to your superiors that a successful military operation has somehow served the strategic interests of the enemy more than your own? How do you describe an enemy that treats defeat as victory, casualties as investments, and destruction as education? Most importantly, how do you recommend future policy toward a species that has demonstrated the ability to transform any military engagement into a learning opportunity that makes them more dangerous? The report she finally submitted was classified at levels that ensured it would never be seen by anyone outside the highest echelons of Imperial command. Its conclusions were stark and uncompromising. Humanity represented a form of military threat that existing Nexarian doctrine was incapable of addressing. Their approach to warfare was so fundamentally different from accepted galactic norms that engaging them in military conflict served their purposes more than those of their enemies. The recommendation that accompanied these conclusions was equally stark: avoid military engagement with human colonies unless absolutely necessary for Imperial survival. When such engagement was unavoidable, expect casualties and strategic costs that far exceeded any possible military gains. In essence, Zarathul recommended that the Nexarian Empire adopt a policy of avoiding human worlds whenever possible, not because humans were militarily superior, but because fighting them served their interests more than their enemies. Years later, when other alien species asked Zarathul about her experiences on Kepler 442, she would tell them that the most terrifying thing about human warfare was not their weapons, their tactics, or their willingness to sacrifice themselves for victory. The most terrifying thing about humans was their ability to lose a war in such a way that their defeat became more valuable than their enemy's victory. She had witnessed humans on the battlefield and finally understood their fearsome reputation. It was not built on strength or technology or superior numbers. It was built on the simple recognition that humans approached warfare with a fundamental understanding that most species lacked. Sometimes the most effective way to win a war was to lose it, so well that your enemy never wanted to fight you again. And in that understanding, Zarathul realized lay the true source of human power in a galaxy where warfare was conducted according to rules that humans had never agreed to follow.